So I went over to his house, and when I arrived, he introduced me to a friend of his who had shown up that day, sort of out of nowhere. He hadn't seen Joe in years. I think he was an old army buddy of John's. Hadn't seen him in years, and yet Joe just showed up at John's door this particular evening. I met him. So he showed up that particular evening at John's home, and I met him. This big guy, a mustache, well built, very firm handshake was one of the things I remembered about him. So he and John then went out to dinner, and there was a UFO conference in New York that evening. They went to it, spent several hours together, and had long sort of catch up conversation. And then Joe disappeared. John couldn't find him. His phone was disconnected, just completely inaccessible. A couple of years later, John is going through Macy's department store and meets Joe's wife, who's working there. He says, "Oh, how are you? How's Joe?" And his wife said, "Oh, I'm sorry. Joe passed away 5 years ago." And John said, "But I saw him only 3 years ago. How's that possible?" And his wife said, "Now, come on, don't mess with me, John. I was with him when he died, and we went to the funeral and all that." Um, so John was flummoxed, and he had heard of these things. We'd never experienced it before. And I have to tell you that, assuming that this is true, I had no clue that Joe was anything but a real flesh and blood human being. So this, for me, raises the question of, how many people we see out on the street are just visiting,
Okay. So welcome to Caritas Consciousness Project. I'm Gloria Coelho, and Caritas is dedicated to promoting the evolution of consciousness as the key to individual growth and global healing. We draw from a wide assortment of both ancient wisdom and leading edge studies in science, consciousness studies, spirituality, philosophy, paranormal, and in addition to our online presentations with guest speakers, we offer classes and study groups also online. And we do some healing work also, which you can find out about on our website. So we have over 100 video recordings on our YouTube channel, Caritas Consciousness Project. And they're also on our website with links to the YouTube channel on the video library page on our website, caritascenter.org. As a nonprofit organization, we rely on the support of our members and donors to keep Caritas going. And if you'd like to support our program, you can make a donation or become a member on our website. And now let me introduce tonight's guest speaker. Dan Drasin is an award-winning documentary filmmaker, and he's been a photographer and media producer for more than 6 decades. Since the early 1990s, as featured in his documentaries Calling Earth and Scole, The Afterlife Experiment, both of them absolutely wonderful. Drasin has been actively investigating the field of afterlife communication through traditional mental and physical mediumship, and we'll talk about those, as well as modern electronics. He lives in the San Francisco Bay Area. And welcome, Dan. I'm so happy that you're with us tonight.
Well, thank you, Gloria. It's a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to our conversation and on the participation of everyone else, actually.
Great.
Looking forward to questions and whatever comes up. I'm happy.
Wonderful. Okay, so would you like to start out by showing some slides or?
Well, yeah, I just as a general introduction to this, I published my first book last year. It's called A New Science of the Afterlife,
Oh, I
Space.
forgot to mention it, and here it is, and it's really fascinating, really fascinating.
Thank you. Thank you. It was my first effort at writing for publication, and it was it was a tough grind, but I enjoyed it. And if I had to do it over again, there'd be a few things different, but basically I'm happy with it. And people seem to like the book and find it useful and clear. And um, sometimes I say I wrote it for wives to put under their skeptical husbands' pillows. Uh, I hope it fulfills that purpose as well. And I thought I would uh, share a slideshow that I show when I do my live presentations. So let's see if I can bring it up here. Uh, Here it is. Can everyone see it?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Right. Um, Oops. Sorry. Okay. Um, yeah, this is the cover of the book. And in my live presentations, I first thing I ask is, does anyone here doubt the existence of an afterlife? And so that sort of gets the room going, and people we discuss this question for a while. Then
I
I
don't see any hands.
right. Okay, so then we get into the show. Yes, we're all going to die. Yay. But fortunately, death is perfectly safe and natural. It's like taking off a tight shoe. I love that quote from Seth.
Mhm.
But how do we know that's true? For some, it's a matter of intuition or belief. For near death experiencers and witnesses to afterlife manifestations, it's a matter of direct experience. For the rest of us, honest scientific investigation can be a good way to familiarize ourselves with it and get to feel more comfortable with it. But how can we bring science to bear on something that isn't even considered real in our materialistically oriented culture? Materialism says the whole of reality is based in matter. But this is an unproven belief system or assumption about reality. In its own way, it constitutes a de facto world religion that's really questioned. And interestingly, one of the odd things about materialism is that it ignores the leading edge of quantum physics and particle physics, which is very clear about the fact that, what's physical is made up of stuff that's not physical. So, but never mind that.
Details.
Yeah. In any case, science is not necessarily materialistic. It's simply a method of inquiry. I like to think of it as organized curiosity. It can mean any systematic inquiry designed to maximize useful knowledge, experience, or insight, and minimize error, illusion, or self-deception. That's not an absolute. We do the best we can with it. Science can be supported by stringent methods and rules, or it can be as simple as trying something to find out whether it works or not, rather than blindly taking someone else's word for it. You often hear people say, "Okay, let's be scientific about it and try it," and that's as scientific as anything. Science evolved, you know, back in the Renaissance, and one of its ground rules was we're free to do our own experimentation, ask our own questions, and not take the word of the church or any established authority about it. So, as a universal method of inquiry, science is free to ask questions and collect evidence about anything under the sun and beyond. It's in this spirit that I wrote A New Science of the Afterlife. In a playful way, the book addresses some of the social, philosophical, and linguistic barriers that impede our society's access to vitally important post-materialist research and information, including the question of an afterlife. And I think the linguistic part is really important. In fact, the longest chapter in my book is about language and how language determines our perceptions. Um, a lot of what language does is reflect back to us our cultural assumptions or the assumptions of our particular culture and reinforce them. And it takes a radical look at language, with which we unconsciously construct our picture of reality. Um, and the if you sit in a cafe sometime and just observe or overhear people, maybe a bilingual group of people who are discussing whatever, they'll often switch from one language to another because one language can better express what they're trying to get across. And I think it's important to realize that if you even if you learn one more language than your native language, it's so helpful in illustrating to us how kind of specialized our own language is to our own particular culture. So the book particularly spotlights particular words in English, of course, such as these: afterlife, proof, supernatural. I mean, what what supernatural it means is beyond our culture's normal definition of natural, but that's arbitrary. Isn't everything natural? These are labels, but they're very powerful and psychological motivators for us. Paranormal, right? If we put the parameters of normality here, then everything out here is paranormal. But if it's here, but how do we know? We can't talk about these things. How do we know what's normal or not? I think that's one of the most important questions we can ask is how do we know what's normal? We don't know that, as I say in the book, we don't know that our next door neighbors don't have rollicking conversations with their dead aunts and uncles at 9 p.m. every Wednesday. Because who would talk about, who would admit to it, right? So, and I often find that when I ask people about their experiences, if they feel comfortable with me, they will share things that they wouldn't normally share. So how widespread this is, we don't know, but I think it's fun to find out. Okay, objectivity, reality. What's reality? And reality is usually based on our beliefs about reality, and to some extent our experiences. And the reality is something that can be debated till the cows come home. And I venture a definition of reality in my book, which is simply anything that can give rise to consequences. So think about that for a moment. Anything that can give rise to consequences, which means a thought, a dream, any movement in consciousness, as well as anything in the physical realm. They all give rise to consequences. So that's my attempt to define reality. Then there's the veil. We talk about the other side being beyond the veil. And so I asked the question, what's the veil? And to me, the veil is our senses, our physical senses, because they convey to our consciousness only a certain very narrow spectrum of even a physical reality. And we know this for centuries now. I mean, ordinary Western physical science has demonstrated that there's so many aspects, even of the physical world, that our senses are just not sensitive to. We know that about animals. That's been known forever, that animals have senses that go beyond ours. But how far does this go? Those beyond the veil when they communicate, tend to communicate quite a broad variety of experiences and inner and outer experiences that seem quite science fiction-y to us in many ways. Anyway, that's the veil. Goes into words like imagination, atheist, God, form, essence, mind, spirit, consciousness. I think a really important couple of words here are separation and distinction. Yes. And I think we need to tune into the difference between separation and distinction, or the distinction between separation and distinction. If we think of consciousness as say an infinite ocean, and a soul, for example, as a wave, say a big surfer's wave in that ocean, that we can point to almost as a distinct separate object, but it's not separate. It's made out of the ocean. It's ocean plus energy. So it's not separate, it's distinct. And I think if we start thinking more in terms of distinction than separation, we will have a more accurate picture of the nature of consciousness, the nature of souls, this life, the so-called afterlife, and so on. So distinction means that what we take to be individual things or souls are just modulations or special cases of something that is universal and eternal,
Like we're a
infinite.
unique, we're a unique, each of us is a unique expression of the oneness,
Right.
right?
We are unique, and yet we're all of the same, made of the same stuff ultimately.
Exactly. And we're all connected.
Right.
Yeah, like the ocean and the wave.
Yeah. Um, so I think that that's an important thing to be aware of, even just, in our everyday lives. Um, then there's time. That's another favorite subject of mine. Um, in the book, I suggest that there are basically two kinds of time. There's objective and subjective, or what we think of as physical time, basically. And physical time is based on the constants of our physical universe, orbits, the physical processes, the tick-tock of clocks, the day and night cycle, orbiting of planets and moons and so on. And these are all governed by certain constants. And so objective time or physical time can be measured quite accurately. We're getting better and better at it every day, dividing it into tinier and tinier parts. And then there's subjective time. And we all know that while they tend to track in the same direction, they certainly don't seem to go at the same speed. They say time flies when you're having fun, and when you're bored, everything takes forever. So, and I think that's important because my impression is that in the afterlife, time is subjective time rules, which means that not every soul experiences time moving at the same pace or in the same direction. That to a great extent we create our own individual and collective realities on the other side, and that when the reality we create is highly individual, we're kind of running on our own clock. When we create a collective reality, my guess is that everyone in that collective reality experiences the passage of time more or less at the same rate, and that's just an assumption, but I think it's probably true to some extent. By all accounts, there are both individual and collective realities that we create on the other side, and just as we do in dreams, and particularly in lucid dreams. So time and space, very relative. Let's see, where are we? Space, soul, incarnation. Um, so yeah, I think the surfer's wave metaphor is a good one. Incarnation, I I use the metaphor of it's kind of like when you climb into an automobile and you suddenly have uh, powers that you didn't have when you were not in that automobile, and you identify with that automobile. You say, "Oh, he hit me in the right rear fender," that sort of thing. So we merge with the car, and that's kind of a process of incarnation. So in doing so, we lose some of the normal abilities that we have as a walker or a swimmer or a runner or a dancer. We can't do any of those, but we have other particularly focused abilities and powers that we can apply as the driver of a car. So I think it's a useful enough metaphor. And what else? Incarnation, death. Well, um, death. Onward to the next slide. Uh, yeah, the book asks whether these words, as commonly understood, tend to help or hinder our understanding of the afterlife. Also exposes the cult of skepticism, um, casts a forbidding shadow of what our culture is permitted to consider real. I think this is an important consideration. Um, one of the most unfortunate things I think on the internet now is, and I love this is it's about Wikipedia. I love Wikipedia. I use it a lot, and it sort of has a dark side
Yeah.
in that they have a sort of a hidden editorial staff that makes it its business to edit entries that have anything to do with what we call the paranormal and to apply the sort of standard pseudo skeptical arguments, um, usually without any evidence whatsoever. Um, I wrote an essay called Zen and the Art of Debunkery. It's kind of a satirical essay, and you can find it on a website called skepticalaboutskeptics.org. Skepticalaboutskeptics.org. And in addition to my essay, there's a whole section on Wikipedia and what they've gotten away with in terms of really trying to find the right word for it, but basically discrediting anything that our mainstream culture considers paranormal.
Yeah. In no uncertain terms.
Mhm. Um, On a more positive and concrete level, the book presents over 15 areas of post-materialist consciousness-related research underway currently, including these. Probably most of the folks here understand what and who autistic savants are. Folks who they used to be called idiot savants, but they are hardly idiots, and they have access to worlds of information just bam like that, just at the tip of their tongue. Some can remember everything they did every hour of their lives. That's quite. I've seen some interviews with folks like that, and they're just absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
And one of the interesting things about um, autistic savants is that many of them have diminished brain capacity. Some of them suffer from a condition called hydrocephalus, where the brain cavity is mostly water, mostly fluid, very little brain tissue. And yet these people function more or less normally, and they have access to all this information from what you might call the Akashic record. So this raises the question of whether our brains, as serviceable as they are most of the time, um, are also barriers to say a higher frequency of knowledge accessibility. Um, so I think that's an important aspect of this. There are also questions involved, which I'll get to in a little later, about psychedelics. Next, terminal lucidity. This is a relatively recently acknowledged phenomenon, which doctors and nurses and um, folks at deathbeds have known for ages. And this is that folks with serious brain damage shortly before they pass may go through a period of perfectly normal awareness and conversation, as if their brains had never been afflicted. And this happens for a short period of time, and then the person passes. So the question I have is, did the afflicted brain simply get out of the way and open a direct channel to the individual consciousness? So this has not been explained except in some relatively recent neurological research, where they've found the patterns in the brain that occur at this time. And that doesn't actually explain anything, but it shows a correlation between this very unusual kind of wave of energy that passes through the brain and what it actually is and what causes it. I don't think anyone knows. Okay, similar to that, or in the same genre, is the shared death experience, where people who are at someone's deathbed, it could be a loved one, a relative, a nurse, may actually see the person leave their body. And in some cases, they have the experience of joining them in their journey to the initial stages of the afterlife. And so that's also been relatively recently acknowledged and named the shared death experience. Um, psychedelics, we all know about psychedelics, and one interesting thing about them is that to a great extent they function as a function of diminished brain activity, not increased. There are certain parts of the brain that are stimulated, but generally speaking, we're talking about diminished brain activity, which again suggests that the brain is a kind of a filter, and that certain psychedelics remove part of that filtration. The placebo effect. We all know about the placebo effect. We know that clinical trials have to guard against the placebo effect and rule it out. And because, of course, the mind is not supposed to influence the health of the body, and yet clinical trials have to take this into account. Lucid dreaming. Lucid dreaming is where folks know they're dreaming while they're dreaming. They know it's a dream. And those who do, many of them practice creating their dreams consciously in real time. And I sort of think of lucid dreaming as the kindergarten of the afterlife, in that it gives us a taste of living in an environment made out of consciousness, basically. Precognition and presentiment. We've all probably heard about the government's experiments in remote viewing that took place at SRI International years ago. The CIA and the Army developed actionable intelligence using some of their more talented remote viewers. And this also throws into question a conventional view of reality. But there it was. It had very concrete, practical results. Precognition has been verified in the lab in tests in which people were being shown on a computer screen a series of photographs which would produce predictable brainwave responses in most people. And what was found in many cases is that the predicted brainwave response would begin to occur before the person actually saw a given image. It's a fraction of a second, but quite measurable. So that really throws the whole question open, because if you can do it for a fraction of a second, it's still precognition. Clairvoyance and remote viewing, map dowsing. That's a practice, a remote viewing practice, where a target is perceived as a position on the map. I had a personal experience of this. A friend of mine was a musician, was performing in a theater in Oakland, California, and left her harp in the storeroom overnight. When she returned the next day, the harp was gone. So her mother got in touch with a map dowser, and he said, "Send me the map. I'll take a look." So she sent him a map of the San Francisco Bay Area, just really thousands of square miles, and got back to her and said, "In this particular 4 square block area, put up posters offering a reward." So she did that, and the harp came right back. So that was fun, and very fortunate for the young woman who got her musical instrument back. Telepathy needs no introduction. Book also examines some of the most outstanding and robust evidence for an afterlife. And these include near-death experience research, which really started in earnest around about the 1970s. And it's sort of the baseline for many people's understanding of the fact of an afterlife. We've gotten so much information from near-death experiencers. For a couple of years, I used to regularly attend the local chapter of the International Association for Near-Death Studies, IANS, and it was just one of the greatest experiences of my life listening to because people came live and did presentations, and just listening and being in the presence of these people, um, and learning over time, what is individual to these experiences, and what is unique to an individual's experience in the afterlife. I'm really fascinated with, excuse me, people who have had strong religious training, who some of whom will swear that they saw Jesus and Mary on the other side. Some of whom said, well, I saw Jesus and Mary, but I know that these were benevolent guides masquerading for my sake. So I would feel comfortable with them. And others don't see Jesus and Mary at all. It's not in their experiential vocabulary, you might say. And that's just one aspect of the NDE, but it's one that I find particularly interesting because I've been fascinated with the relationship of ideology and religion to our inner experience, and I think that's the testimony of near-death experiencers is just a wonderful. It's sort of a treasure of that sort of information. Um, Okay, out of body experience, research and practice. You're all probably familiar with Robert Monroe's books, Journeys Out of the Body and Far Journeys and Ultimate Journey. This is a guy who was a radio producer in New York City in the 1950s who started having spontaneous out of body experiences. And he thought he was going crazy. And so he got himself tested and nobody could find anything wrong with him. And luckily, a friend of his, who's a psychiatrist, said, "Well, what you're experiencing is considered extraordinarily valuable in other cultures, and it's something you can develop." So he did. He developed certain practices and techniques to induce and optimize near-death experiences. He started the Monroe Institute in Charlottesville, Virginia, which continues today. I've been there. It was a wonderful experience to be there, and it's now the out of body experience is now considered something we can all talk about, or at least some of us can talk about. Reincarnation research. We've all probably heard of the research being done or that has been done at the University of Virginia for years and years. In my book, I focus on a particular case of a young American boy named I'm totally blanking on his first name. Last name is Leininger.
James.
Pardon? James,
James.
yes. Thank you.
Which was his name in both lifetimes, which was
Right.
interesting, right?
Right. As when he was too young to speak, he was drawing pictures of air battles. He was having intractable nightmares. And as soon as he could speak, he began to describe this having been shot down as a pilot. When he was, I think, 2 years old or thereabouts, his father took him to an air museum, and young James pointed out a particular aircraft, named it, and talked about its features and shortcomings. His parents then did a bunch of research in the U.S. Naval database. James had, excuse me, James had remembered the name of an aircraft carrier. He said Natoma. So his dad went online and found that there was an aircraft carrier called the Natoma Bay, which was stationed in the Sea of Japan towards the end of the Second World War, and that there was one airman who had been shot. He was the one airman to be shot down in a particular battle near Iwo Jima. His name was also James. And long story short, it turns out that this was the previous lifetime of young James Lane. Um, they eventually tracked down the sister of James Houston, who was the deceased pilot. Um, James had already um, told his parents about his former family and lots of facts about it and people's names and the fact that their father had been an alcoholic. And James Houston's sister verified it all. So anyway, the story goes on, but it's a wonderful case because it's a modern case. Um, and there's online, I give the references in the book for a paper that was written um, that basically answers all of the skeptical arguments about the case. Okay, mental medium research and practice also needs no introduction. Um, the book includes full chapters on the reincarnation case and the subjects of my two most recent documentaries. Calling Earth is about afterlife communication via modern electronics. And this is something that's been going on since the 1950s. Um, it's a practice that anyone can do with the right intention, I think, and the right patience and some very simple equipment. It started showing up in the 50s when tape recorders first became consumer items. And people started hearing faint voices on their tapes that didn't belong there. And in the United States, this was pretty much written off as, well, maybe the machine picked up a radio broadcast or something. So no one paid much attention to it. But in Europe, it was really a different story. Um, the I think the ball got started rolling with a Swedish gentleman by the name of Friedrich Jurgensen, who was well known in his time. He was an artist, a filmmaker, an opera singer, and a talented and very bright individual. And he was out one night recording nocturnal bird sounds for a documentary he was producing. And when he played the tape back, he heard the nocturnal bird sounds. And between the nocturnal bird sounds, he heard faint voices discussing nocturnal bird sounds. And he thought this was kind of a peculiar coincidence that someone on the radio was talking about bird sounds. But not long after that, he heard the voice of his deceased mother calling him by his childhood nickname, Friedel. So at that point, he sort of threw up his hands and said, this is something's going on here, and we need to investigate this scientifically. So he started, practicing what we call EVP. You would ask questions into his recorder, and when he played back the tapes, he would hear answers that made sense. And he recorded many thousands of these voices in his lifetime. He was then joined by a Latvian researcher named Konstantin Raudava, who worked with him for a while and then went and did his own experimentation. And by the time he died in 1974, he had recorded some between 60 and 70,000 of these voices. And he published a phonograph record. You can hear some of this in my film, where he shared a certain number of these, actually dozens of these voices that he got on his tapes. And then after he passed in 74, he showed up in the communications of his colleagues on Earth and was able to communicate for minutes on end. And that was very unusual because most of these EVP voices really only last a few seconds, typically under 2 seconds, very short phrases or sentences. But Raudava, quite extraordinarily, was able to conduct conversations lasting several minutes. And you'll see some of this in my film. So and that eventually evolved into visual ITC images being received on fax machines, television sets, and so on. and sometimes on setups that were intentionally designed to produce EVP images. You'll see some of this also in my film. And this leads us into the field of physical mediumship, of which the Scole experiment is probably the most amazing example. And physical mediumship, of course, is where physical phenomena are produced with the help of those on the other side. In the Scole experiment, which ran for 5 years, it ran 500 sessions in the late 1990s. And it produced an incredible variety of physical phenomena and physical evidence. And you can see some of this in my film called Scole, the Afterlife Experiment. I won't get too much into this, but it was quite spectacular. And unlike a traditional physical mediumship, it did not involve the use of ectoplasm. In this experiment, the experimenters on this side, there were mostly two couples who worked together over this period of 5 years. And they worked with a spirit team on the other side. And what they did was they worked together to work out these experiments just to see what worked, to see what phenomena they could produce. Some of them were photographic, some of them were video, some of them were physical objects appearing on their table out of nowhere. When I filmed in their home, just a few years after the experiment ended, they had collected a lot of these apports. And the most fascinating to me were a couple of newspapers printed during the war years, 1944, 1945, which appeared on their table in the late 1990s. And these newspapers were absolutely pristine. I held them in my hand. This is several years after they arrived. So the outer pages had begun to yellow a bit, but the inner pages were pure white, as if they'd just come off the press. When they had actually had these papers analyzed by the Paper Industry Research Association, who did lab tests on them, and they said, yes, this was newsprint that was produced during wartime, which had a particular chemical signature. So this was all highly evidential stuff. Okay. And they also had a lot of fun during this experiment. There was a lot of humor and sort of playful experimentation going on, and it was hardly the sort of sepulchral atmosphere some people might equate with afterlife communication. It was quite the opposite in many ways. So what else? Okay, here's a 5-minute trailer for Calling Earth, the film about electronic voice phenomena. I think I have to do something.
Both documentaries are just fascinating. I encourage everybody to see them because they're really wonderful and wonderfully put together. The content is exciting and fascinating, and it's done very well.
I think the fact that we survive bodily death is a scientific fact. It's nothing to do with religion.
One day in the summer of 2002, Martha Copeland of Lawrenceville, Georgia, played back a sound recording she'd made earlier that day and heard the voice of her daughter Kathy disciplining her dog. That wouldn't have been so unusual, except that 6 months earlier, Kathy had died in an auto accident.
One evening, to my great surprise, with some equipment I was developing at the time, I heard a voice. I was really startled.
After the second or third test, I immediately got voices saying, "We are the dead, we are alive, we are able to think and to speak."
A brief definition of the electronic voice phenomenon, or EVP as we call it, would be the existence of voices of unknown origin which appear in tape recordings particularly, but could also be recorded in other ways.
It was the voice of my late father, and he addressed me with my nickname. he used when I was a little boy.
Here was this voice that I recognized immediately as my mother.
Missing you, Cal. I know, great. Happy birthday. Love you. Happy New Year.
The voice then calls the experimenter's name, Konstantin Raudive.
This is Konstantin Raudive speaking. I'm as fine as a dead one can be.
The experimenter states that in his opinion, man cannot grasp the events after death with his intellect. A voice replies in German, kann. He can.
If somebody came up to me in the street and said, there's nothing paranormal about EVP, I would say, well, I believe in experimental evidence. I've done at least 20 years and hundreds of experiments, and I know that it is a paranormal effect. Now, how many experiments have you done?
When the phenomena expanded into pictures, faxes, computer messages, actual phone calls, another term had to be coined, and that became instrumental transcommunication, or ITC, which basically means communication through instruments.
International conferences held in the United States and Europe have drawn ITC experimenters, scientists, engineers, psychologists, and medical doctors from around the world who share their experiences, present the results of their research work, and discuss methods for better understanding the nature and meaning of ITC.
Whoa!
Oh my God.
Oh my goodness, this is very clear.
Oh, check that out. That's totally him. Oh my God.
It's objective evidence. So it has changed our lives completely.
Science appears to preclude the possibility of an afterlife, but science evolves and there's no knowing what possibilities may be acceptable to a future science.
Maybe it's a superstition, maybe it really happens. The only way to find out is to study the phenomenon and find out whether it happens or not.
We should be devoting enormous social resources to this question, not leaving it up to a matter of belief.
So, any questions, or we can go on to the Scole experiment trailer?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. The reality of ITC is strongly supported by the practice of physical mediumship, in which the surviving consciousness of deceased persons is claimed to produce various effects in our physical world, including sophisticated interactions with our audio and visual technologies.
In physical mediumship, phenomena happen of a physical nature, meaning objects move, things appear, disappear, things that people can see happening. There's an effect on real objective things.
For a closer look at physical mediumship, let's travel back in time to the late 1990s in the tiny English village of Scole, where the most extensive and long-running experiment ever attempted in afterlife communication unfolded over a 5-year period in the darkened cellar of this 17th century farmhouse.
The Scole experiment was the brainchild of two veteran afterlife researchers, Robin and Sandra Foy, who worked closely with two of Britain's most accomplished mediums, Alan and Diana Bennett, and what they claimed to be a corresponding team of experimenters on the other side. During their 500 sessions, all of which were recorded on audio tape, the Scole experimental group went into a meditative state to connect with their other dimensional counterparts. The goal was to collaborate in devising and conducting experiments that could produce tangible physical phenomena, which could then be studied and analyzed objectively. Robin Foy's remarkable 550-page book, Witnessing the Impossible, chronicles each of these 500 sessions, many of which were observed by visitors, eventually totaling in the hundreds, including top-tier scientists and engineers. The experiment was also monitored by three experienced investigators of paranormal phenomena: electrical engineer Arthur Ellison, research psychologist David Fontana, and veteran researcher Montague Keene.
All sorts of things have happened, particularly in this 20th century, which earlier generations would have said were impossible.
Skeptics are often unaware of the amount of experience and the amount of knowledge that goes into investigations of this kind. Between the three investigators, you could say we'd had 50 years and more of experiences of this kind. We know all the tricks.
Initially, we were all pretty skeptical because what had been claimed seemed so way out.
The Scole experiment was reported in contemporary magazine articles, 2 books, a 400-page scientific report, and a full-length documentary film. Its successes included nearly 1,000 hours of direct communication through the mediums, and an impressive variety of intriguing physical phenomena, such as tiny animated lights that flew around the room. The Scole group also witnessed what they claimed to be the spontaneous appearance of physical objects. Perhaps the most astonishing of these objects were these newspapers, which arrived in mint condition, despite having been published in the 1940s.
We took it to the leading research station in the world on paper and printing, and it was absolutely clear from their report that this was a genuine article which appeared 50 years after the event, and no one has been able to explain how it got there.
In other sessions, a video camera loaded with brand new blank tapes and switched on in a darkened room produced an amazing series of colorful abstract frames. The tapes also contained unexplained light phenomena and enigmatic faces. A conventional 35mm film camera placed on the table in their darkened room initially produced a series of black and white images that the Scole group were told were faithful duplicates of existing photographs from around the world.
Some were photos of existing photos, and they said initially that was easier for them to do before they went on to photos that had never existed.
Continuing photographic experiments using isolated rolls of film and no camera were carefully controlled by the independent investigators.
We would buy the film ourselves. We would load it into a box. The box was held in the hands of the investigators so that no one could get at it. And then immediately afterwards, we would take it out of the box ourselves so that no one else touched it, and then develop it ourselves in a special machine.
To everyone's surprise, these films revealed a stunning variety of content. This included whimsical drawings and symbols, diagrams, writings and poetry in multiple languages, as well as portraits and signatures of known individuals. The Scole group also heard voices through a tape recorder from which the microphone had been removed.
Scole Experimental Group.
Yes.
Yes, Scole Experimental Group. Experimenting with audio equipment.
Yes.
Historic moment it is.
First record was described as an unreal consciousness for another dimension.
They also recorded voices that apparently came directly out of the air, most often that of a British engineer, Reg Lawrence, who claimed to have died in 1942 and possessed a special talent for this type of communication. Here's another actual recording made at Scole, in which Lawrence responds to a question from visiting engineer Walter Schnittger.
Do you see any possibility to describe how you can get the air to vibrate that we can hear it with our ears?
We do not speak. We think in a language we are familiar with.
Yeah.
And by some miracle, I have to say, these energies are transported into the room, not by me, but by those whose job it is to do that.
These discarnate communicators often demonstrated that while their physical bodies may have turned to dust, their sense of humor had not.
You all right over there, John?
No.
No.
Shut your eyes.
Yeah.
Yes. Think of something very nice. No, not that. Think of an ice cream or something like that.
Ice cream.
How do I know that the phenomena come from the afterlife rather than from the mediums themselves? We simply have clues of information which was extremely unlikely to have derived from the mind of the medium. And the more impressive those are, the more likely it is it's an aspect of discarnate communication.
Second-rate scientists would say, well, this so-called paranormal phenomenon cannot have occurred, and therefore it must be conjuring. It must be stage magic. Well, that is not my idea of good science. It's not possible to dismiss the excellent evidence quite so readily.
I could not do it myself as a professional magician. And I don't believe in any magician that I knew could do this. I'd say they were wasting their time doing this here for nothing when they could be earning $1 million out there on the stage.
If you take all the phenomena within the whole of the Scole experiment over 2 years while we were there, I would say that the possibility of fraud and faking was nil.
These things are so extraordinary that when one tells them to people who've not had the experiences themselves, they think, oh, it must be trickery. And the challenge then always is, okay, you duplicate it.
So, any questions?
Oh, let's see. Well, if we're going to switch to our conversation, one term that I have not come across before, and maybe you could explain it a little bit, is consciousness code. What do you mean by the consciousness code?
Well, I threw that in because it's trendy to call things codes these days. But no, seriously, I could actually read that is the consciousness code is the shortest chapter in my book.
Mm-hmm.
And I could probably just read that. Let's see. It's well, I'll just I have chapter summaries at the end of each chapter. I'll just read that. What is the consciousness code? Codes, natural and artificial, exist all around us. Codes hiding in plain sight don't exist until we recognize them for what they are. our own consciousness hides in plain sight. Becoming aware of it allows us to experience living and dying in a healthier, more comprehensive, beautiful, and masterful way. So it's like,
yeah,
it's hidden from us, and yet it's there all the time.
Consciousness.
Consciousness, right.
Yeah.
So our society, our culture is so externalist in its point of view and in its language as well, that we forget that, who is it that's looking through these eyes?
Mm-hmm.
What is the nature of our experience itself?
Yeah.
As forget who it was who said this, you can't get behind consciousness.
Right.
It's you can't take it apart, you can't analyze it. Essentially it's primary. And some folks believe that it is primary to everything, including the material universe.
Mm-hmm.
It's consciousness that that it wasn't this bearded Caucasian grandfather in the sky saying "Let there be light," but that consciousness itself is what has been keeping this game going, probably for eternity. And eternity is one of these things that it's hard for us to grasp, because our minds need to divide things up into bits and pieces with beginnings and ends to have definition. But we have no proof whatsoever that the universe began with the Big Bang or whatever it was. There's all kinds of controversy in the cosmological community now, whether the Big Bang was the beginning or the end of a previous cycle, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the main thing to remember is that there was no beginning. If there is anything at all, it must always have been in some way, shape, or form, or on some level of energy. Mm-hmm. And so we're beginning to entertain now the notion that what we call consciousness, which we experience as consciousness, is actually the stuff of creation. And it's certainly we certainly see that quite obviously in the arts, where things which have never existed before suddenly exist. It's true in the arts, it's true in technology, in the fields of invention, which from my understanding is often seeded from the other side, where people get brilliant insights out of nowhere, or seemingly out of nowhere. And so I think it seems to me that the healthiest and the most creative societies and cultures are those that are also the most creative. I think it's certainly true within our own societies that the fields of the arts are the least likely to make war with each other. I think that sends us a very important message. The importance of creativity.
And yet mainstream science still believes that consciousness is produced by the brain. And whereas I think actually the brain is a filter. It filters out a lot of consciousness that we have access to once we leave the body.
Right. We can access it by leaving the body. We can access it in meditation. We can access it through psychedelic experiences.
Near-death experiences.
Near-death experiences, obviously, yes. One of the things I say about when we attribute consciousness to the brain, it's like confusing a stained glass window with the source of light.
Yes.
We think the light's coming from the window somehow. It's only a filter. It's a modulator of light. And once we recognize things for what they are, we gain a certain degree of freedom, not only in our beliefs and our picture of the world, but also in our own trajectory through life, and how we make sense of life, how we are with others. Are we manifesting a contentious view of life, or are we manifesting love? I mean, a lot of it comes down to that.
Yeah.
And we look what's going on in the world today, and was it really meant to be this way?
Mm. Yeah, it's the belief in materialism that I think is largely at the root of the crises that we face today, because it's live for today, and the one with the most toys wins at the end. That whole paradigm of materialism.
I think that's the joke about the guy that dies with the most toys wins. I think that's one of the most grotesque aspects of our culture.
Yeah.
We worship the manifestations of ego, of wealth, and arbitrary power, and so on.
Yeah. And we see ourselves as consumers, not even citizens anymore. We're consumers.
That's true.
Right?
And if you read enough contemporary journalism, you'll find people using the word consumer where they should be using the word citizen.
Right. Yeah. And that's deliberate.
I think in some cases it is. I think in some cases it's just unconscious. It's what we've come to think of ourselves as,
Right. Well, it's conditioned, but the conditioning is deliberate, I think,
A lot of it is.
Yeah. Has anyone inquired of someone like Konstantin Raudiva, right? What determines who is able to receive these messages? I mean, they say anyone can do it, but it seems like I remember one person, I don't remember which experimental group it was now, and I don't even remember which of the two documentaries. I think it was in the Scole, but I'm not sure, who said, we persisted for 2 years before we had results, and then we started having a lot of results. I don't think most people would persist that long,
Yeah.
So, what are the ideal, I guess, what are the ideal intentions, motivations, circumstances in trying to, in attempting to get results through EVP or ITC?
Well, in my film Calling Earth, there are some suggestions made. And the most important is, I mean, obviously you have to have your technology set up. You have to have whatever device you're working with. But beyond that, it helps to have an emotional bond with someone on the other side. And I think that's partly because they will already have been trying to get through to you forever. Whether we have the ears or the eyes or not, it appears from many communications that I'm familiar with that they're always trying to get through.
Yeah.
And so that's the most important thing. And then to be patient. One suggestion is to try your EVP experiments at the same time every day. It sends a certain message of concentration and focus and devotion to the practice. We haven't the foggiest about what either impedes or facilitates ITC. It could be the phase of the moon, or the astrological configurations, or the weather, or it hasn't been practiced enough by enough people in a systematic way for us to recognize these patterns. So that would be, I think, one fruitful area of potential research.
Yeah, and also, rate of success given ideal circumstances, ideal environment.
And I also tend to feel that people who have subconscious reservations about the whole thing or have, attributed some spooky quality to this, maybe unconsciously setting up resistance to the
And could impede a group who's trying to do it.
Yeah. So
yeah. Oops,
so
my mouse isn't working.
I'll
I got it.
Okay. Yeah. So we don't have all the answers, but we have enough answers to say that, hey, this is real. And even though it's not as reproducible as some simple physical experiment, enough people have reproduced it under enough different circumstances and conditions to to tell us this is kosher, this is real.
Yes. Yeah.
I think you would ask another question before.
Well, let's talk about one of the things that I had not heard about in terms of near-death experiences, and we've had presentations on that, and we've, I've read various books on it. But one that I hadn't heard about that you mentioned in your book is the verifiable messages given to near-death experiencers to be delivered to complete strangers from their families on the other side. I thought that was really interesting. I had not come across that. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, the one individual that I've met personally who's had that experience was a young woman who lived not far from here in the San Francisco Bay Area. She comes from I believe, a Mormon family, which was difficult for her because when she reported her NDE, she sort of became ostracized by her family.
Why?
Because her experience conflicted with the beliefs of her family.
I see.
Yeah, she was. They were going to have her examined, let's say. And this happens to people. People get locked up or put in psychiatric institutions or get drugged when they report these things. Not so much anymore, although it still does happen for when people just aren't familiar with the NDE. Anyway, in this young woman's experience, she had been allergic to certain medications, and she was in pain one day. She took a little extra of particular medication, went into anaphylactic shock, and was gone. She found herself then in the lobby of a building. There were outer doors and then inner doors that went into some other space. Imagine a theater lobby. So she finds herself standing in this lobby, and she sees people coming in the front door, and she knows they've died. And they mill around the lobby, and then they go into the inner doors. And she knows that when they've gone into the inner doors, they can't come out again. That's their trajectory then.
Right.
So at one point, she sees 4 teenagers come in the front door. And a young girl comes up, and she says, I knew they had just died in an auto accident. The girl comes up to her and says, I know you're going to be going back. I want you to give my mother a message. And gives her the message. So after this young woman comes back, and she's resuscitated by her husband and so on, she remembers this information. And one day she's at I think it was a church, with some event going on, some presentation, and she felt somehow compelled to go out into the lobby for no reason at all. So she goes out into the lobby, and she's a woman sitting on a bench in tears. And she goes over to the woman, can I help you? Turns out that was the girl's mother. And she was then able to get the message. So,
yeah.
And how often these things go on? I mean,
yeah.
Who would admit to it?
If the girl could have somehow known that she would come in contact with her mother, or was told, who knows? Yeah. Very interesting. Very interesting.
So, what do we know?
Yeah. Really. Um, would you share the story about the full materialization of your friend John's friend Joe?
Yeah.
I love that story. I love that story. It is quite amazing.
Well, I had heard about materializations, and I was actually kind of skeptical about them. Less so after becoming familiar with the Scole experiment, which involved apparently quite a few materializations. But this was way back in 1967. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Mothman story. This was the subject of a very poorly adapted.
Brent Rains, we had Brent Rains a few weeks ago.
Oh, you did? Okay. Well, then you know.
So he talked about John
Yeah.
Keel, his book on John Keel and the Mothman.
Right. Well,
Yeah.
John Keel was this wonderful paranormal investigator.
Yeah.
At this was back in the 1960s. I had just lived in New York City at the time and had my first UFO sighting. So friends suggested that I meet John Keel, who was giving a talk that week. So I went to his talk, met him, and we became friends. And at the time, he had been investigating these paranormal events that were going on in this town in West Virginia called Point Pleasant, which is right on the Ohio River between West Virginia and Ohio. And long story short, he invited me to come out with him to help him do some research there on some very strange events that were occurring in that area, including a lot of UFO sightings and sightings of a sort of otherworldly creature that they called the Mothman. It was many people had seen it. It was about 7 or 8 feet tall. It had big glowing eyes, like right out of sci-fi, and a set of wings. And it would levitate off the ground, and then it would fly, and it would chase cars and scare the hell out of people. It was just a fascinating phenomenon. So I made 3 or 4 trips out there with John to West Virginia, and one of the things that we were told, there was a psychic in the town who told us that there's going to be a disaster on the river the night that President Johnson lights the White House Christmas tree. So John and I were back in New York on that evening, and we decided we would get together and watch TV and see if anything happened in West Virginia. So I went over to his house, and when I arrived, he introduced me to a friend of his who had shown up that day sort of out of nowhere. He hadn't seen Joe in years. I think he was an old army buddy of John's. Hadn't seen him in years, and yet Joe just showed up at John's door this particular evening. I met him. So he showed up that particular evening at John's home, and I met him. He's a big guy, a mustache, well-built, very firm handshake was one of the things I remembered about him. So he and John then went out to dinner, and there was a UFO conference in New York that evening. They went to it, spent several hours together, and had long sort of catch-up conversation. And then Joe disappeared. John couldn't find him. His phone was disconnected, just completely inaccessible. A couple of years later, John is going through Macy's department store and meets Joe's wife, who's working there. He says, "Oh, how are you? How's Joe?" And his wife said, "Oh, I'm sorry. Joe passed away 5 years ago." And John said, "But I saw him only 3 years ago. How's that possible?" And his wife said, "Now, come on, don't mess with me, John. I was with him when he died, and we went to the funeral and all that." So John was flummoxed, and he had heard of these things. We'd never experienced it before, and I have to tell you that assuming that this is true, I had no clue that Joe was anything but a real flesh and blood human being. So this, for me, raises the question of how many people we see out on the street are just visiting, and there's no way to know.
Yeah, it's really quite amazing. Yeah.
Things raise many questions, and I think these are, for me, they're humbling experiences. I can't claim to know the truth about reality, but but I do the best I can. I think we all do the best we can.
Well, you mentioned the children who remember previous lives. And one of the things that I remember, we had Jim Tucker came to our center in Boulder years ago and gave a presentation. And I remember him telling me that most of the children who remember previous lives died in a violent way, either through natural means like an earthquake or something, or at the hands of, a murderer. I think he said something like 70%, 75%, something like that. And it made me think that, putting that together with the fact that they reincarnate relatively quickly, because that's how they're able to, number one, remember. I think a lot of them don't cross over. They stay earthbound and reincarnate rather quickly. So they haven't gone through the whole process, processing of their life and everything. So the memory is still very fresh in their mind. And I think that that sometimes happens when it's a violent death. The soul is kind of stuck for a while and maybe doesn't cross over and maybe wants to reincarnate, come back because it feels like it didn't finish its life or whatever. I think the most fascinating accounts to me are the ones where the child is born with birthmarks that correspond to the manner in which they were killed. And one such story was a little boy in America who, when he was old enough to talk, he was misbehaving one day, and his mother said, she was getting exasperated because he wouldn't listen, and she said, if you don't listen to me, I'm going to spank you. And he said, when you were a little girl, you misbehaved and I never spanked you. And she said, what are you talking about? And he said, I was your daddy. And her father had died he was a policeman in New York City, and he had died trying to prevent a robbery. He was shot in the back. The bullet pierced his pulmonary valve and exited out his chest. And when the baby was born 18 months later, that's pretty quick, 18 months later, she gave birth to her son. He had a birthmark, a round cylindrical birthmark on his back corresponding to the entry wound of the bullet, and another one more jagged in the front corresponding to the exit wound. And he had to have surgery right away because his pulmonary valve wasn't working. And they didn't put it together, even so, until he said that. And then he started saying things like, do you remember you had a kitten and you called him Boston and I called him Boss, and, all these little details, And so eventually they got in touch with Jim Tucker, and he went out to investigate, and, they showed him class pictures of his grandfather. And he immediately, as a child, right, in like 5th grade or something, and he immediately pointed and said, that's me, So it was really very fascinating. There were a number of cases like that where there were birthmarks corresponding to how they died. Yeah.
Birthmarks, blemishes, sometimes disabilities.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think that it sort of makes sense that the after the previous incarnation they didn't cross over completely.
Right. So the memory is very fresh in their consciousness, more so than if they had,
I'm not personally clear about that progression and where the crossover begins or ends. I think it's probably a matter of degree for each of us. But the meaning is clear that crossing over completely is more or less permanent, stable condition, and that there this unstable condition between the lives where we can come back and perhaps communicate more easily
Yes.
in one way or
You
another.
talk in your book about people who are stuck in this bardo kind of state, right? Earthbound state, and how different mediums try to help them, to cross over. And it's something that we have done, having been a spiritist center. The spiritists call it disobsession work. But in any case,
just want to mention that a friend of mine died a few years ago, and his name was Neil, and he had his body frozen. He was a very scientific type, and he believed in that whole business of, well, they can freeze the body, and then maybe someday science will figure out how to defrost and revivify and so on. So he had that done at considerable expense, which his wife, who survived it, was not too happy about. And a few years later, I started working with this wonderful team of mediums, who I talk about in a minute. But one of them, Regina, I'd mentioned Neil to her, and she said, well, let me check him out. So she went psychically to the facility. It's called Alcor, which is in the Phoenix area. And she psychically went in there, and she said, first of all, she said the vibe in that place was horrible. She couldn't wait to get out of there, but she stuck around long enough to observe what was going on there. And Neil himself was kind of, his being was kind of attached to the cryopreservation cylinder where his body was, and kind of, psychically bound to it in a very compulsive sort of way. And long story short, she kind of pried him loose and convinced him that he'd have much more fun by letting go and getting on with his afterlife. And so he has since sent me some communications with words of thanks for this. And he says, when you're on this side, let's get together. We have a lot to talk about. So I look forward to my conversation with him in the great sidewalk cafe on the other side. Anyway,
well, some people get stuck in that realm because they don't believe they're dead too. I mean, if you don't believe in an afterlife, then you must be still alive, right? Why can't people hear me? Why can't people see me? Here I am. So that's one. There's a lot of different scenarios in which people get stuck. Some are afraid of being punished for something they did. If they cross over, that God might punish them. There's all kinds of things that keep people earthbound.
I wasn't raised with any kind of strong religious conditioning, and I can only imagine how people who have been strongly conditioned by the whole heaven and hell scenario must be in tremendous confusion when they pass over.
Yeah. And really, we need more mediums doing that work, because there are a lot of people, like in Brazil, there's tons of mediums doing that work. But in this country, very few. I see Gary has his hand up, and I think we need to open it up to Q&A, because otherwise we'll run out of time. So I have so many more things I could talk to you about, Dan, but I want to give the other people a chance. So Gary, let's see. There's also some stuff in the chat. He says, I have a question, but seem unable to get Zoom to enable my microphone. I wonder if others are experiencing the same. I don't know. Tink has a question. Gary, did you type? Oh, here. The late Dr. Stevenson, who founded the institute referred to by Dan at the University of Virginia, talks about birthmarks and deformations in the children Gloria is referring to. Yes, Gary, Jim Tucker took over. He worked with Stevenson, Ian Stevenson, and then he took over the project after Stevenson retired.
Right. Yeah, one of the fascinating. Now, I've never really read through all of Stevenson's literature, but I love the accounts of his bringing, and he did a lot of research in India, where of course this is more accepted, bringing children to the site of their former life, and the child sort of being adopted by the former family as a friend.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's
Sorry,
right. That happened in one scenario. Okay, so he says, I have a quibble with the comment made by the woman that introduces the trailer of one of the videos. She said the subject had nothing to do with religion. I know what she means, but I think that religion has everything to do with how many people see such things, and it can act as an impediment to being willing or able to entertain the matter. And I'm like the Mormon woman that you were talking about, Dan, that was religious impeding. I'm thinking also of a secular form of religion that influences many people these days who are not involved in traditional religion. I'd also like to ask whether Dan knows about the work of Walter Semke,
yeah.
MD, San Francisco-based physician.
Right. I've actually met Walter a number of years ago, but I'm not that familiar with his work.
Okay.
I mean, I haven't.
Okay, this
I
is
know
a very
of it, but
long.
no.
I don't know if we can. It might take the whole half hour to read all this. Anyway, so he tells us a little bit about Simcu's work. One important case involves a woman in Sweden who now lives in the US, who as a young child had memories and talents that suggest a connection with Anna Frank, who has become famous through the diary left in the place where she and her family were found by the Nazis during World War II. She's been recognized and accepted by Anna's uncle, which has gotten him in some trouble.
I'm familiar with that story, actually, yeah.
Yeah.
And it would appear that she was the reincarnation of Anne Frank.
Yeah, I think there have been a number of claims to that too. So maybe she's the right one. I don't know. So he was working with the spirit guide.
Question. Could you address if there's any research of these past lives could be ancestral memories that we can tap into? I think it's a very good question. But it would be kind of hard to separate that from the possibility of having been that ancestor. So you'd have to do a lot of objective research to filter that out and decide one way or the other.
Yeah. Okay, Tink has a question. Let me see what her question is. I hope not everyone is having trouble with their microphones. There's nothing I can do. It's your microphone. Let's see. Where is it? I'm looking because I thought she had a question.
Gary Trujillo asks, I'd like to know whether Dan has a comment on the Trump, Nero, and Putin, Julius Caesar connections. I think I don't have a comment on it, but I think it would be the stuff of a wonderful novel or a movie script. It certainly makes sense, you know. Anything else in the
says Claude Swanson said on the other side are about 40-ish years old over there, young and healthy. I'm not sure what that means exactly.
By many accounts, the way that we present ourselves in the afterlife
I see. You're
represent us at more or less the prime of life.
Yes,
Now,
yes.
But my understanding is that people can voluntarily shift that if they want to appear older and more mature or younger and sillier, they can do that.
Right.
Generally,
Yeah. I thought she was
what I
saying.
heard, Yes, from
Yeah.
what I've heard, people present as if they're sort of in their late 20s.
They also present as what the person they're presenting to would recognize. So if they only knew them as a senior, they would probably present as a senior. They want to be recognized. That's the main thing. And, probably want to look their best also, right?
Well, I've heard that many times, and it seems to me that when we speak of the afterlife, we need to let go of our notions of space and time. That in the book, I suggest that the afterlife is a grand hologram made of consciousness. And in the metaphor of the hologram is important because in a hologram, every part is present in the whole to one extent or another. And so when we say when two individuals present themselves to each other in the afterlife, my sense of it is that one part of this hologram is projecting an image, say the image of being in the prime of life, to the other who is perceiving the intended projection. Someone else over here, a third party, may be, let's say I'm in the afterlife and I'm projecting to you. And I'm projecting myself as I was when I was 29 years old. But over here is someone who only knew me as an older person. And I might project to them at the same time a different image. So it's not like I'm wearing a suit that's a particular age. It's these images take place in the other's consciousness. So I think that's kind of how that sense of community and communication works there. That we're all fish in the same pond, basically. But we synthesize holographically, you might say, things like appearance and physical dimensions and that sort of thing. And it's like we're painting with light, or we're painting with paint, even that hasn't hardened yet, and can do it any way we wish. And I'm sure that in those realms of the afterlife, which are considered musical, that there's such a huge variety of what we think of as music that goes beyond what our physical ears could hear. I'm also certain that the great composers had much more going on there than they could possibly express through a symphony orchestra.
I love that quote attributed to Bach that you have in your book, where he says he's on his deathbed and he says, "Don't cry for me, I'm going where music comes from." Such a beautiful quote. Tink also said, "I heard from Dad years ago and he was 40s with a blue golf shirt." Mara was asking, would you be so kind as to repeat the name of the essay that you have on the Skepticism About Skepticism website and the precise name of the website?
Okay, the precise name of the website is skepticalaboutskeptics.org. It's one word, skepticalaboutskeptics.org. And the name of my essay is Zen and the Art of Debunkery. It's a sort of a tongue-in-cheek stab at the skeptic community, and I'm actually thinking of revising that and publishing it as a book. It's one of the projects on my docket right now. So, and I have a lot of fun with that because well, don't get me started about skeptics.
Well, I like what you said about how a real skeptic is not someone who's closed-minded, right? Or not in those words, but that was what I got out of it. That a real skeptic is, we all need to be somewhat skeptical about communications from the spirit world, because skeptical about, the source of the communication, because there are spirits who also deceive. And so we have to discern through normal means, the same means that we would with a person who is alive, right? Depending on what they're saying, we because there are people who think if it's a spirit communication, it's got to be like a saint or an angel or something, and it doesn't necessarily,
I think that the healthiest approach to all communications, whether it's from the afterlife or a politician, uh, is a kind of agnostic attitude.
Yeah.
For me personally, the only things I have to believe absolutely, or anything on which I have to take a real action in the world, make a decision in my life. Other than that, I don't have to let the pinball fall in the little hole permanently. I like to keep it in play. And there are certain things which over time tend to naturally prove or disprove themselves. And I think part of sorting all these things out is to stick with it for a while and see if the shoe fits, see how it feels. If it feels questionable, it may be questionable. I've been working with a wonderful team of mediums for about 5 years now, and I was very impressed when I first met them. I was extremely impressed with them. But we became personal friends. We've worked together now for quite a while, and we've put up a website a few years ago. It's called cosmicvoices.network. Cosmic Voices, one word, .network. And the two mediums are Jean Love, who lives in Los Angeles, and Regina Ochoa, who lives in the middle of nowhere in the western panhandle of Nebraska, farm country. And Jean, when she was a little girl, she was told by a psychic, says, "You're going to be a medium to the stars." And what Jean says now is, what she didn't tell me is they'd all be dead. And so she has a connection on the other side, where when someone in the artist community, artists, performers, musicians, and so on, when they pass over, they find out about her. And the joke is that so many people want to come through her that they're having to give out numbered tickets on the other side. And so in some of the channelings, they refer to, "I got my ticket punched," But seriously, many of these messages are quite amazing. And you can read them as fiction if you don't believe they're true. But they convey a really wonderful and all convey wonderful and important messages. And so on the website, we have, on the messages page, we have two columns. One is names you may recognize, others names you may not recognize, people who are less well known. The process for me has been fascinating because I'm sort of the editor. When a message comes through, Regina will send it to me, and I'll look through it, and I may do copy editing, punctuation correction. I might remove some highly personal information, but essentially the messages are as received. Occasionally, there'll be something I don't quite understand or wasn't expressed quite right. And so the medium will go back to the source and get it sorted out. And on a couple of occasions over the phone, they have put me directly in touch with the source on the other side. And that's been a really amazing experience. In one speaking of this sort of thing, I was partnered with a woman for 11 years named Jane. She passed in 2007. And some years after that, I was on the phone with Regina, one of these two mediums. And she says, "Oh, Jane is here." She says, I'll hear her words and I'll translate. I said, "Fine." So what happens is Jane essentially pushes Regina out of the way. I'm talking to Jane on the phone directly. Well, through Regina's voice, but with Jane's character and mannerisms and so on. And it was quite an experience on many levels for me, as an emotional experience, and also just the fact of, wow, this is possible. This kind of communication is possible.
That kind of answers Nellie's question, which is, in our culture, the term making closure with the person who is transitioning. Do you feel that's important to do that? And I'm thinking, as you're saying that, I'm thinking it's never too late. You know, if you didn't get to have closure with the person before they passed, before they transitioned, then you can still have closure afterwards. You know, because they can, even if you don't hear them, they can hear you.
Well,
Right?
this is, I agree. This is my understanding that it's easier for them to, as it were, lower their frequency than for us to raise ours, and that they can be aware of us and our surroundings and our activities and so on. And so sometimes, if I'm feeling a particular connection with some friend of mine on the other side, what I'll do is I'll sort of make the assumption that they can be aware of me, and I'll make some gesture or say some word, or as you say, make an apology or come to a closure in one way or another. And I figure it can't hurt, you know, even though I may not receive an acknowledgement and on the level that I can understand it or receive it. I've done what I need to do for myself,
Right.
and I think it's important. So, you know, as
Yeah.
a gift to oneself as much as the other person.
Yes. Tink wants to know when does the soul enter the body?
I've heard different accounts of it. Some folks say it happens. I think most of the sources that I'm familiar with say it happens very late in the pregnancy, after the body is physically viable, and in many cases, apparently, the soul will come in and out. We'll get a taste of being in the physical body, and then we'll move out, and then we'll come back perhaps more frequently. And then, you know, at the moment of birth, the soul is more or less permanently glued in. But
that's what spiritism teaches.
If you look at developmental psychology, though, there's the question of the different parts of the being incarnating at certain ages, like that the mental capacities tend to come in around age 7, and this is confirmed in when children report past lives, that they may be very much connected. You know, as soon as they can speak, very often they start talking about. I have a friend who lives in the San Diego area, whose young son, as soon as he could talk, he was saying, you know, things look different. This place used to belong to Mexico. This area used to belong to Mexico. And he started talking about how it looked different than when he was alive at that time. And so his mom, you know, hit the history books and found out that everything he said about that particular area was true historically. And fortunately, she's a very open-minded and sympathetic person. Many kids get, you know, kind of shut down when they start talking about their past lives. And you know, if the family is either, you know, simply skeptical from a so-called scientific point of view, or, you know, their religious training forbids it, then the kid gets, you know, the kid's got to can it, you know, repress it. But anyway, the point here being that usually by the age of 7, the memories tend to fade, and that's when what's called the mental body tends to incarnate. So, my assumption has been that incarnation isn't like an all or nothing process. That different parts of the being come in at different times. Some of them before physical birth, and sometimes after that. And I imagine it, in a way, it may continue throughout one's lifetime. You know, our sense of self differs from one age to another. At least that's been my experience. And it's, you know, it's different times of life are for different things and different focus. And
the brain has something to do with it too.
Yeah.
Because you know, at the age of 7, I mean, a lot of major religions consider the age of 7 very like a turning point, an inflection point in a person's maturity, in a child's maturity. In the Catholic Church, that's I remember I was raised Catholic, and I remember the nuns telling us, when you turn 7, you are now responsible for your sins. And I remember not wanting to turn 7. But 7 is when you have your first communion, your first confession, all that stuff. And other religions also have, and astrologically also, it's the first Saturn transit, and is a maturing planet, and
And the Saturn return, Saturn
return about 28 years.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, Saturn. Well, we are almost out of time.
Lou just made an interesting posting here. He says, according to Joseph Pierce, the nervous system myelinizes at 7.
Yes.
Right. And from my meager understanding of neurology, that sounds almost like putting insulation on the wires.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, and that makes sense. That by that time we're supposed to be here, focused here, and
Right.
none of this nonsense about other.
Rudolf Steiner based the Waldorf education on astrological cycles of development, and they don't do reading or writing or math until they're at least 7, because they feel that there is learning that needs to be done in more in different ways, like more that the abstract kind of thinking should take place after the age of 7, and up until that point, they learn through hands-on, they learn through fantasy and all those kinds of things.
I have a grandson who's in a Waldorf school, and there's been controversy in the family over the fact that screen time is restricted, and he doesn't read yet, and his cousins are reading circles around him, but he is the most creative, out of the box, charming little sprite met. So
well, the idea is that they can learn to read even at the age of 3 or 4.
And then start in first grade,
but it displaces other learning that they should be doing.
He learns finger knit instead of to get his motor coordination for writing, but they don't want to start these boring. I mean, in the 50s, forget it. And they say, we just spent all day copying the letter H. I hated every minute of it. So I think he's very fortunate.
Yeah. Well, I think we're out of time, Dan, and I could go on for another 2 hours, but I can't because we're out of time. But thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope we'll see you again sometime.
Sure.
Very interesting. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's been a pleasure, Rose. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great job, Dan. Really good.
Did you want to say something? Oh, I did want to ask you if you have another project in the works of some kind.
Well, besides wanting to publish a little book out of my debunkery essay, I got a couple of screenplays in the works.
Oh, great.
So I'm focusing on writing a few little documentary things I'm doing, but I'm in my sprint to the finish line. I'm turning 82 this year, and my spies on the other side tell me I got a while more here, not so fast, and you're not going to get out of here right away. So I'm kind of making my bucket list for what I'd like to accomplish here, and
go to Brazil and visit a Spiritist center. You will love it. In fact, I could tell you a very good one to visit.
Thank you.
Yeah, they're all different. But
some of my relatives that emigrated from the Ukraine back in the 1920s went to Brazil. We had some relatives there for a while.
What part?
In Sao Paulo.
Oh, Sao Paulo. Well, I'm more familiar with Rio, but Sao Paulo you know, Brazil is Brazil.
I've done a lot of traveling in my previous life as a documentary cameraman. I did quite a lot of traveling, but not a whole lot in South America. I was in Venezuela for a day and that sort of thing. But I know Brazil is a very, very interesting place. I recently saw a film that a friend of mine made, James Fox, about a very famous UFO crash and retrieval in the city of Varginha. Yeah, I'm trying to think of the name of the film. It's I can send it to you, but it's quite good, and he may go back there because once he made this film and people came back to him with more evidence and contacts there, and we hear more from that. But I love listening to Portuguese. A lot of Portuguese dialogue in the film, and hopefully, if I do go down there, I'll learn some of the language. My Spanish, I think I have enough Spanish under my belt to be a tourist in a Spanish country, but Portuguese, I'll take a while to get used to the sound.
It's a beautiful sound.
Yes.
Dia você vai falar. Dia você vai falar. One day you will speak it.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you all for attending, and thank you so much, Dan. It was great.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, bye.
It was great.